The Six-Day War, third of 5 Arab-Israeli wars. A conflict whose outcome was made inevitable by air power on the first day. A war fought on 3 fronts, each quite different. The Sinai Desert, scene of dramatic tank battles and the destruction of an entire army. The largely urban street battles in Jordan as the Israelis fought their way into the holy city of Jerusalem. And the mountainous Golan Heights, torn from Syrian control by bulldozers, tanks and infantry. Israel was created by the United Nations partition of Palestine in 1947, giving 45% to the Arabs and 55% to the new Jewish state. The Israelis gained further territory when hostile Arab reaction led to war. All 5 Arab nations declared war in an attempt to stifle Israel at birth. Israelis struggled for their state's very existence, creating a defense force characterized by officer-led units and reliance on flexibility, surprise and innovation. The 1949 armistice established new borders, largely where the opposing armies' front line stood at the end of hostilities. But the conflict also created huge numbers of Palestinian refugees. 350,000 fled to Jordan, mostly to the West Bank area. Unlike Jewish refugees, the Palestinians were not absorbed by their new host countries. Instead, they were left in camps where they became a focus for Arab discontent. With no lasting peace, a revolution in Egypt bringing Gamal Abd al-Nasser to power made another war increasingly likely. Assuming command of the combined armies of Egypt, Jordan and Syria, his avowed intention was the destruction of Israel, but the Israelis resolved to strike first. An Egyptian blockade of Tehran prompted the Israeli offensive, which opened with a paratroop drop near the strategic Mitla Pass, backed by armoured assaults. The campaign then gradually built up momentum with attacks to isolate the bulk of the Egyptian army in the north and to end the blockade that had been denying Israeli access to the sea. The Israeli plan was designed to keep the Egyptians guessing whether it was an all-out offensive or just another reprisal raid. Both sides used weapons mainly of Second World War vintage in battles that demonstrated the lasting importance of tanks. Israel's victory proved she had built an effective army on the experiences of the 1948 War of Independence, an army marked by a positive ability to adapt to rapidly changing circumstances. And the architect of that victory, General Moshe Dayan, would go on to repeat it more spectacularly in 1967. Egyptian strategy was flawed. It kept strong forces close to the Israeli border, but most of them on the wrong side of the Suez Canal. They therefore celebrated a victory, maintaining that they'd been forced to withdraw under threat from British and French forces. They had parachuted in to secure the Suez Canal, recently nationalized by Nasser. Scuttled ships remained as a sign that little had been achieved to bring peace to the region. Israeli settlements were attacked, some shelled, others were the target of guerrilla raids by Palestinian fedayeen. The tempo of tit-for-tat border raids and reprisals grew as the Israelis dug in to protect themselves. They responded by mounting cross-border raids, first against villages sheltering terrorists, then against regular military bases. This was Jenin in Jordan. Over a decade, 1,000 Israelis died, but little is known about Arab casualties. In 1964, an Arab scheme to divert the waters of the River Jordan away from Israel heightened tension further, bringing the Israelis to the brink of war. The biggest Israeli reprisal raid brought armor and air power onto the village of Al-Samu in Jordan. It was also the first Israeli raid mounted in daylight. Al-Samu had been a forward base for fedayeen from Syria, mounting raids on Israeli settlements in the northern Negev near the Dead Sea. In April 1967, a major dogfight developed between Syria's Russian MiGs and Israel's French-built Mystères as the Israelis struck at Syrian artillery that had been shelling settlements. In a foretaste of the war soon to follow, 6 Syrian MiGs were lost. Alarmed, the Syrians sought Egyptian help. They responded by demanding withdrawal of the United Nations troops who'd been guarding Israel's southern border by occupying Sinai since the 1956 war. In mid-May, the United Nations Secretary-General U Thant unilaterally agreed to this demand and the crisis deepened. 3 days later, 7 Egyptian divisions with over 100,000 men and 1,000 tanks had massed along Israel's southwestern border. Huge armoured convoys were on the move too in Jordan. Jordan's leader, King Hussein, was more worried about seeming to be the odd man out in the Arab alliance than by the possibility of war. Within a week, Arab armies had massed at all Israeli borders, creating a crisis from which they hoped to gain political advantage. But as Arab war hysteria mounted, Egypt was unable to control that crisis and effectively backed Israel into a corner. The thousands who poured onto the streets were forcing action against the state they wanted to destroy for 2 decades. Israelis mobilized against what they saw as a clear threat. But time was vital. The Israelis couldn't keep their citizen army in uniform for much more than 2 weeks without endangering their economy. They also lacked the geographical depth to fight a defensive battle and then mount a successful counterattack. Defense through offensive action was their only option. To run that offensive, the Israelis brought in General Moshe Dayan as Minister of Defense. An underground fighter during the War of Liberation, he had proved a daring battalion commander who established the ruthless fighting spirit that typified Israeli operations. A brilliant strategist, he was the architect of a stunning victory. The Egyptian leader, Gamal Abd al-Nasser, was the driving force who brought on the war, but he consistently underestimated Israeli strength and commitment while exaggerating Egypt's strength in a manner that proved fatal as he failed to foresee the tactics that would be employed against him. Jordan's King Hussein was Egypt's reluctant ally, afraid of being the odd man out among the Arab nations. He led the most effective Arab army, but was deceived by his allies, losing half his kingdom as he was abandoned by Iraq and Syria. Hafiz al-Assad was the Syrian defense minister who saw his air force destroyed on the ground as he delayed opening a third front. His failure to help Jordan was bitterly resented by King Hussein. As the Arab nations moved their armies onto Israel's borders, Israel resolved to mount a preemptive blitzkrieg. It was spearheaded by the Air Force, which in the first few hours won complete air superiority by destroying the Arab air forces on the ground. The Israelis scrambled at breakfast time. In the first wave, French-built Mystère fighter bombers. Air Force commanders had correctly assumed that the Egyptians would be unprepared, with most officers still driving to their bases. Peeling off to fly in low under Arab radar, the strike planes knocked out the Egyptian Air Force largely before it could leave the ground. Air crews flew some 500 sorties before mid-morning. At each briefing, pilots were told their first priority was to destroy planes on the ground, spending as long as possible over the target and returning on minimum fuel. Mirage 3s speed to their distant targets, flying low over the Mediterranean to evade Egyptian radar. Some Egyptian MiGs escaped the onslaught. Altogether, 19 Egyptian air bases were put out of action and over 400 planes destroyed as the Israeli jets arrived simultaneously over their targets. Those Egyptian planes that did get airborne were destroyed in dogfights. The Israelis lost 26 aircraft, but won air supremacy, which proved decisive in the fighting to come. This remarkable achievement was summed up by its architect, the daring and innovative Israeli air commander, Major General Mordecai Hod.
The Egyptian Air Force was destroyed, or almost destroyed, in 3 hours. As a matter of fact, a little bit less than 3 hours, but I'll make it around the figure. The achievement, of course, was made by pilots, very young ones. The average age of the Israeli pilots is about 23. They are all trained here by the Israeli Air Force, and now I can say they are the best pilots in the world.
With command of the skies, Israeli armour mounted a complex series of lightning strikes, notably on Abu Agela and other key Egyptian fortified towns in northern Sinai and Gaza. A series of battles took them west to Bir Gafgafka and south to break the blockade of Tehran and complete the encirclement of the Egyptian divisions at Nakle. Monday, June the 5th, 1967, and the Israelis prepared to launch their singularly devastating offensive across the Egyptian border. Here in the desert wastes, 3 Israeli divisions had gathered to face 7 Egyptian divisions, a force nearly 3 times larger and with at least double the number of tanks. The assault was spearheaded by the British Centurion tank, which decisively outscored the Russian-built T-54-55s used by the Egyptians. Alongside them, jeeps with anti-tank recoilless rifles. The speed of the advance surprised the Egyptians, who expected the slower tempo of opening moves seen in 1956. But instead of striking at the centre, the Israelis attacked Gaza. The breakthrough was achieved by the 7th Armoured Brigade, commanded by Colonel Shmuel Gonen. They outflanked the fortifications and minefields, attacking over dunes considered impassable by the Egyptian defenders. Fierce hand-to-hand fighting followed the tank battle, and the main towns fell before dusk on the first day. Egyptian tanks fell prey to well-armed and efficient infantry. Israeli tank commanders were also frequent casualties, a result of fighting from open turrets. Some trenches were only cleared after bitter exchanges. But it was accomplished with little loss of momentum to the offensive. The strategy continually was to trap and encircle enemy armour and destroy it as it tried to break out. The Israelis entered Gaza on Tuesday lunchtime, halfway through the second day after what they described as a brutal battle. But the pause, like the welcome, would be short-lived. Thousands of mines had to be cleared from the deep echelons of the Egyptian defensives. But as some rested momentarily, others fought street battles to flush out the last resistance by Egyptian commandos. It was a bitter and unexpected defeat for the Egyptians. The Egyptian commander in Gaza, Major General Abdul Munah Husseini, still looks bewildered by the speed of his force's demise as he signs the surrender document, hastily scribbled out on a scrap of paper by his Israeli captors. Further west, Wessex helicopters brought in paratroopers by night to outflank Egyptian strongpoints in the most important battle of the Sinai theatre for Abu Agheila. Here, the Israeli offensive was led by a future defense minister, General Ariel Sharon. Once they reached the main Egyptian defensive positions, Sharon brought forward the divisional artillery units to soften them up by persistent bombardment. Abu Agheila fell at lunchtime on the second day after what was probably the most complicated battle of all the Arab-Israeli wars. By Wednesday, Egyptian forces were fleeing for safety beyond the Suez Canal. Israeli training aircraft, modified to take rockets, joined the attack on the disintegrating Egyptian armies. They swooped on the fleeing convoys as they converged on the bottleneck of the Mitla Pass, just 20 kilometers from the Suez Canal. Mirage 3s, recently brought from France, were also bombed up. Refueling, rearming and changing pilots took just 7 minutes before the next series of strikes that decimated the Egyptian army east of Suez. Israeli brigades were now being closely coordinated to prevent them mistakenly firing on each other. Seven Egyptian divisions, 70,000 men, were totally destroyed in scenes that became famous around the world. In many cases, vehicles and weapons were simply abandoned in the haste to get back to the Suez Canal. Hundreds of vehicles littered the landscape. With the dramatic collapse of the Egyptian army, the way was wide open to the Suez Canal. In front of them, fewer than 100 of the Egyptians' 1,000 tanks managed to cross the canal to safety. Their rout had been compounded by conflicting orders from the Egyptian commander, Field Marshal Abdul Hakim Ammar, which created panic in the defeated army. The strategic rail bridge over the canal was reached on the fourth afternoon. But none of the troops who relaxed along the canal banks that Thursday would say that it had been easy.
I have seen it to be not very easy. They were fighting from house to house. You can see the shells in the houses here, that people had to fight from house to house. Most of it was done by the tanks, the light tanks.
Yes, he is one from the big fighters here.
How good was the Egyptian fighting yesterday?
Not very bad, but we are better.
In the east, the Israelis began by cutting off Jerusalem from the bulk of the Jordanian army in the north, which also found itself quickly under fire. Further offensives north of Jerusalem seized control of the Judean hills. Within 3 days, most major centres west of the Jordan were in Israeli hands, including the ancient cities of Jericho and Bethlehem. The The Jerusalem corridor was the key to control of the Judean hills and Jerusalem, for it overlooks all approaches to the holy city itself. Its strategic importance had been recognized in ancient times by Joshua. The Ḥarb brigade was sent in to secure it after Jordan had opened hostilities with an artillery barrage. They advanced on the strategic radar hill in difficult mountainous terrain where well-fortified Arab Legion positions covered all approaches. A crucial tank battle was fought by night, the Israelis' old Sherman tanks using their searchlights to pick out targets regardless of the risk to their own columns. The brigade finally broke through the Jordanian lines to seize the mountain ridge and road connecting Jerusalem and Ramallah. And Israeli jets used their air supremacy to decimate fortified positions outside Jerusalem and any attempts to reinforce them. The battle for Nablus was typical of the Jordanian front. It was largely an urban affair, fought over the streets and buildings of cities and towns with deep religious connotations for Jews, Muslims and Christians alike. Just as in Vietnam, half a world away, the medevac teams were helicoptered into battlefield situations to take out the wounded. Reservists taken prisoner while still in civilian dress were evidence of the speed of the Israeli assault. Nonetheless, the Jordanians, with the smallest of the Arab armies, proved to be the only ones to inflict damage on Israel as the conflict unfolded. Jerusalem's Wailing Wall was reached on the fourth day, the Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan posting prayers of thanks. This was a deeply religious site denied them under the 1947 partition, but staying there would fuel Arab anger for years to come. The battles for control of what is now known as the West Bank flowed through buildings and fortified positions honeycombed with complex reinforced defences. Here was where they met the men of the Arab Legion's El Hashim and Hittin brigades, their most effective opponents. In the towns, troops found heavily defended buildings, some several stories high, all interconnected by deep trenches and protected by minefields. Here, too, the Israelis suffered half their fatal casualties of the entire war. Once again, it was the potent firepower of the Israeli Air Force that broke the threatened deadlock, as an emotional King Hussein acknowledged in defeat.
The battle was waged against us mainly from the air, almost exclusively from the air, with such overwhelming strength and continued sustained air attack on every single unit, on every single formation of our armed forces, day and night, right till last night.
Thereafter, Israeli troops swiftly occupied villages and towns of both religious and political importance to Muslims, Jews and Christians alike. Here, Jericho, whose walls had fallen without a fight, just as in biblical times. Jordan, a reluctant ally of the Egyptians, had, in population terms, lost half its kingdom. Bethlehem was among the last Jordanian towns to be occupied. Little resistance was encountered because, lacking reinforcements, the bulk of the Jordanian forces had been skillfully withdrawn. Also on the move, a trickle at first, the people whose plight would prove to be the one matter that prevented any attempt at a lasting peace, the Palestinians. Already, Arab propaganda was warning them that there would be no safe haven for them in the occupied territories. The desire to flee was further fueled by the fact that Jordan and other Arab countries paid them remittances. These would be unavailable if they remained in the West Bank. Few did remain to support the suggestion of a Palestinian homeland in the West Bank territory, and the opportunity to use their plight as a political weapon was not lost on the defeated Arab nations. The formidable natural obstacle of the Golan Heights dominated the northern offensive against Syria. Israel's strategy involved three main thrusts to take Quneitra. Two further offensives literally bulldozed their way to command the road to Damascus before a United Nations ceasefire line halted the advance. The Golan Heights dominate Israel from a plateau up to 1,200 meters above the Jordan Valley. With gun emplacements, deep trenches and dug-in tanks, the Syrians had converted the area into a deep defense zone. From here, sporadic artillery and gunfire was directed onto Israeli settlements. Briefing the officers who would lead the assault, the Israelis stressed how Syrian deployments obviously relied on the difficulties of the terrain to aid their defenses. Israeli armor moves north. Freed from fighting in Sinai after the Egyptian collapse, heavy brigades moved swiftly through Israel to face the Syrians. Moshe Dayan had hesitated about attacking Syria in case it drew in their Russian allies. Now the delay had worked in his favor. On the fifth day of the war, he moved on to the offensive, and Colonel Albert Mandler's entire armored brigade moved up along a single axis. To force their way into the mountains and through the complex Syrian defenses, they played an unexpected card. The assault was led by an engineer detachment with a company of bulldozers, which forced a way for the tanks up the rocky hillside. All of them were hit in the action, each losing several crews to concentrated artillery and machine gun fire before their job was done. Gradually, the brigade fought its way up the steep ascent to take the Syrian strongpoints in hand-to-hand fighting. Here, as in the British assault on the Falklands, Israeli forces were personally led into battle by their officers. From the rear, Israeli artillery shelled the most stubborn Syrian strongpoints with pinpoint accuracy. Syrian panic was heightened by Israeli airstrikes. It was a costly advance, but by the end of the first day, the Israelis had broken through at several key points. From then on, the Syrians abandoned their carefully constructed defenses and withdrew rapidly. Next day, the last of this war, the Israeli columns moved swiftly on to the strategic Syrian town of Quneitra. They entered it after a brief hour-and-a-half's firefight on the afternoon of the sixth day. The Syrian army had collapsed in less than 27 hours of bitter fighting. From here, the road to Damascus was wide open and the Syrian capital at their mercy. Only intervention by the United Nations halted the rout. It had cost the Israelis 115 dead. The Syrians lost about 1,000. Their outstanding victory gave the Israelis defense in depth for the first time in their history. Instead of being threatened by neighbors, Israeli forces now occupied the areas from which those threats were mounted. Now they posed the threat themselves. A matter for celebrations. But the celebrations obscured military shortcomings as they overlooked the fact that their achievements were due more to Arab negligence than their own superiority. As a result, the Arabs who now gave in learned more from their mistakes than the Israelis did. And that was something the Israelis would discover to their cost within 6 years in the Yom Kippur War of 1973. Refusal to trade conquered lands for security guarantees fueled the refugee problem that would return to haunt Israel time and again, even until today. Hundreds of thousands of uprooted Palestinians were on the move, many the same people that had fled the Israeli War of Independence 20 years earlier. With Arab countries refusing to absorb them, many professed a desire to live in their homelands in peace.
They are happy to live anywhere in peace.
Yes.
Everything that they need, peace. Everywhere. Nothing except peace.
Israel's Moshe Dayan publicly tried to allay their fears, but privately, most Israelis feared sabotage campaigns if the refugees stayed.
I'm not doing anything to stop them by force. I don't think that anyone should stop anyone if he wants to leave the country. I'm trying to find out why they leave, and if they are scared or something like that, then to lift that, to ascertain them that there's no reason to leave. But if they do want to leave for a personal reason, then we do not stop them by force.
The refugees, however, continued to struggle over the Allenby Bridge into unoccupied Jordan. Whatever the promises, they believed Israeli occupation would be harsh, and their plight highlighted the problem of statelessness and increased the appetite for revenge that led to the Yom Kippur War of 1973.
Saturday the 6th of October 1973, Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish calendar. Israel's border troops, below strength during the holiday, came under surprise attack by Syrian and Egyptian forces 10 times greater than their own. This time they learnt to respect the courage and fighting abilities of the Arab armies. In particular the Egyptians, who fought their way across the Suez Canal with spectacular success, and then engaged them in the biggest and bitterest tank battles since the Second World War. It was a war in which the latest military technology overturned conventional tactics. It transformed the theories of modern warfare. High-tech Soviet missile systems challenged the now established superiority of the Israeli Air Force, hindering their attempts to carry out ground support roles in the first hours of the war. And on the ground, the apparently invincible Israeli armor came up against a new generation of anti-tank missiles. They were operated by highly trained Arab infantry who bore no resemblance to the soldiers routed in 56 and 67. The question all Israelis asked that day was why were they so ill prepared? The answer lay in the stunning Israeli victory of 1967. The key factor had been those first 3 hours of the 5th of June, in which the Israeli Air Force virtually wiped out the combined Arab air forces. The impact of total air supremacy had transformed the course of the war on the ground. Most Israeli military thinking since had been based on the belief that the Arabs would never again risk a major attack without being able to compete in the air. They believed it would be 1975 before Arab air power was strong enough to contemplate another war. However, the sheer scale of the Arab defeat put tremendous domestic pressure on the Arab leaders to try again. Syria's Golan Heights, the West Bank of Jordan, and the entire Egyptian Sinai Peninsula were a constant reminder of the humiliation of 1967. King Hussein, having lost half of Jordan to the Israelis, could not afford another direct clash. But for the new presidents now in power in both Damascus and Cairo, it was a risk they felt compelled to take. Israel still had less than half the number of men, tanks and planes, and a fraction of the missiles that Egypt and Syria could field against them. Those forces would have to cover two fronts, a further handicap for Israel. At the end of the 67 war, the Egyptians had been driven out of Sinai and had concentrated on defending the West Bank of the Suez Canal. The Israelis knew from experience that the key to the desert lay in the passes that crossed through a mountainous ridge beyond their headquarters at Bir Gifgafa. They constructed a defensive line along the east bank of the canal named after General Bar-Lev, and a series of forts were built along it. Tanks would move to prepared positions between them during an alarm. To counter Israeli air raids during the War of Attrition, the Egyptians built up one of the world's densest missile walls, creating an anti-aircraft umbrella over the whole Suez area. President Sadat realized that even without a comparable air force, he could fight a limited war under that umbrella, cross the canal, gain a foothold in Sinai, and then negotiate with Russian help. He shared his plan with Syria's President Assad, who also obtained Soviet SAM missiles to cover the Golan battlefield. They agreed a timetable for a coordinated attack when Israel would be least prepared. General Ahmed Ismail, the Egyptian war minister, was appointed to overall command of both the Syrian and Egyptian forces. He negotiated with the Russians for the military hardware they would need. He shared the planning with his chief of staff, General Saad el-Shazli, a popular hero figure who had led paratroops in Sinai in '67 and was one of the few Egyptian officers to emerge with credit. He rid the Egyptian officer corps of its Cairo playboy image and instigated rigorous training. His preparations omitted nothing. He even studied old records of the Suez Canal Company to check tidal conditions. In the middle of the war, he opposed Sadat over the role of the armoured reserve at a crucial point and was quietly dismissed. On the Israeli side, the defense minister Moshe Dayan was a powerful personality who had dominated Israeli military affairs for years. His courage and flair were amply demonstrated during the Sinai campaign of 1956. But this time he failed to live up to expectation. From the start, he was torn by doubt and unwilling to take responsibility for vital military decisions. He was heavily criticized for Israel's lack of preparation after the war. General Dayan described the Suez Canal as the best anti-tank ditch in the world. He calculated it would take 24 hours to bridge it and cut through the sandbanks the Israelis had built all along the canal, up to 60 feet high in places. Ample time, he thought, for the forts along the Bar-Lev line to be supported by the Armour Reserve, waiting further back in Sinai. The 600 men manning the Bar-Lev forts had grown complacent too. Egyptian exercises had been a regular event for months, and even fresh construction work was thought to be an attempt to stave off boredom. But like the exercises, it was just one part of the meticulous planning that would make the canal crossing an epic military achievement. In October, the Bar-Lev forts were manned by reservists of the Jerusalem Brigade, doing their annual military service. They found out what the construction work was for at 2 p.m. on the 6th. Tank ramps now overlooked their positions. The tanks joined 1,000 other guns pouring tons of high explosive onto the Bar-Lev line, while an airstrike hit Israeli positions deep in Sinai. It was the start of a technically brilliant operation that would restore Arab military credibility. The Egyptians were so proud of it that months later their Third Army reenacted the whole exercise for the cameras. Hundreds of machines wreathed the West Bank and the canal in smoke. Screened from Israeli eyes, 8,000 Egyptian infantry began crossing the canal in rubber dinghies at midpoints between the forts. In 1971, the Israelis had tested a method of pouring oil onto the canal from an underground system and turning it into a wall of flame. The Egyptians took no chances. The night before, frogmen had blocked pipes leading down to the canal. Once the first wave had scaled the bank and established a foothold, tank hunting units moved inland to await the first Israeli armour, equipped with RPG-7 anti-tank weapons, and the latest Soviet anti-tank missile, the Saga. Unfolded from a suitcase, it could be set up in minutes. Its wire guidance system and 3,000-yard range demanded courage and skill from the operators. Each had fired 100 rockets during training. It wrought havoc among the Israeli tanks. One unit alone claimed 8 tanks in the first 10 minutes. With the tank defense now in place and heavier equipment arriving, the second phase of the operation could begin. Designated teams began clearing the Israeli defenses, where the Jerusalem Brigade, after the initial shock, were now fighting back. Further south on the Bitter Lakes, an amphibious operation was underway. Tanks and troop carriers of the Third Army poured more men into the Sinai. In imitation of Israeli tactics, heli-borne troops had been dropped behind the lines. The 130th Marine Brigade had orders to join them in the desert. It was the only failure of the whole operation. The Israelis shot down 14 loaded helicopters, and the survivors achieved little. The Egyptian generals had estimated they would lose 10,000 men in crossing the canal alone. In fact, the barrage kept most Israelis in their bunkers. And throughout this most dangerous and exposed phase of the operation, only 208 men were lost. The problem of how to cut through the sandbanks was solved by an ingenious Egyptian lieutenant who had worked on the construction of the Aswan Dam. British irrigation pumps powered high-pressure hoses which simply washed the sand into the canal. Using this technique, they cut the holes in half the time it would have taken with either explosives or bulldozers. And during the first day, they cut 60 of them. Cutting the gaps was a feat of Egyptian ingenuity, but bridging the canal was achieved through well-tried Soviet expertise and equipment. PMP bridges designed to cross European rivers were put into use for the first time under wartime conditions. The sectional pontoons could be joined to others in minutes. On the day, the Israeli garrison said they grew across the river like outstretched arms. Another Soviet crossing system was even quicker. The GSP ferry was formed by two amphibious lorries which linked together in the water and would then expand hydraulically, creating a platform that could carry a tank across the canal in a matter of minutes. Every aspect of the crossing operation had been thoroughly rehearsed and planned in minute detail by General Shazli's staff, with two goals in mind: surprise and speed. The whole Israeli defensive system in Sinai turned on the assumption that it would take 48 hours to get armoured divisions and heavy equipment across. They were convinced they could foil any attack in that time. In 10 hours, the Egyptians had already got 10 bridges set up and 500 tanks positioned on the east bank. Inside 24 hours, 2 infantry and 2 armoured divisions had crossed the canal. It was the high point of the war for Egypt. Within 30 minutes of the start of the war, the Israeli armoured reserve drove forward into the line according to plan, unaware of the reception that awaited them. They were decimated by the Egyptian tank hunting squads. Air power was inevitably Israel's next response, flying into the teeth of the missile umbrella to stop the crossings, rather than concentrating on the missile sites first, as they'd known they should. Plans for a preemptive strike that morning had been ruled out by American pressure. Israel would get no support if it was seen as the aggressor, as Moshe Dayan had to explain to a bemused nation.
In this case, we considered it, and it was the decision of the government not to strike first, even though we were sure that they will do that, in order to have that political or whatever you call it advantage at the expenses of the military disadvantage.
And that disadvantage was now becoming clearer as the Egyptians consolidated their hold on the east bank. If they survived the missiles, the Air Force still had to locate the bridges hidden beneath smoke screens. Even when hit, their sectional construction made them easy to repair, and they could be floated to new crossing points with relative ease. Egyptian troops rejoiced in their achievement. They had destroyed the first counterattacks exactly according to plan, and now one by one, they were taking possession of the forts along the Bar-Lev line. Not all fell easily, though. The northernmost fort was never taken, and in the south, opposite Port Tewfik, 1 officer and 42 men held out for a week before surrendering through the Red Cross. After repeated attacks, they were down to their last few grenades and bullets. The Egyptian officer who took over the fort believed they'd hidden their heavy weapons. The truth was, they had none. They were ferried across to Port Tewfik, where the survivors helped their wounded comrades ashore and into captivity. Among the Israeli reserves pouring down the road into Sinai on Monday the 8th, morale was still high. Their confidence in another easy victory was reinforced by their route through the Mitla Pass, still strewn with the wreckage of Egyptian defeats in 1956 and 67. But that mood was soon replaced by a much grimmer one, as the reality of the situation and the extent of their early losses became apparent. In those first few days in Sinai, only the Egyptians had cause to celebrate. The Sinai front was 125 miles from the main Israeli cities, but in the north there was no margin for error. The Golan Heights were barely 17 miles across, and from this plateau littered with volcanic rock, 4 routes led down across the Jordan into northern Israel. The Benot Yaakov Bridge bore the most important, leading from Quneitra and the area HQ at Kfar Nafak. A key Israeli observation point on Mount Hermon was known as the Eyes of Israel, as it overlooked the entire region. The Syrian plan was to cross the ceasefire line in one massive armoured assault, 2 columns forming a pincer to take Kfar Nafak and the bridge, while others struck out for minor routes. At 1400, synchronised with the Egyptian attack, a 50-minute artillery barrage began. It paved the way for the Syrian armour, which then swept past the border posts. They flowed in like water, one Israeli said. I never knew there were so many tanks in all the world. The Israelis had 180 tanks and 60 guns with which to hold the 40-mile front. It was the most desperate and heroic struggle of the war. A young lieutenant with a handful of tanks held up the main Syrian thrust for 20 hours at one point, ambushing, switching positions, and attacking again. Mobile artillery proved effective in slowing the advance too, and it was well employed. But the sole Israeli advantage was in knowing the ground. They'd practiced over it numerous times, measuring the ranges and the best angles of fire. But they hadn't anticipated odds of 5 to 1, or at times 11 to 1, and remorselessly they were forced back. As in Sinai, the Israeli Air Force was thrown in to slow the advance. But even at low level, running the gauntlet of the SAM batteries proved costly. They lost 40 planes in the first afternoon. Infantry-operated SAM-7s and anti-aircraft guns joined the white contails of the SAM-6s, crisscrossing the sky to deadly effect. They adapted their tactics quickly, though, flying in low over Jordan to take the Syrians in the flank, avoiding many of the batteries. Wrecked Syrian vehicles lining the route bore witness to their effectiveness, and in places the burnt and blackened ground showed that, like the Americans in Vietnam, they were using napalm. On Sunday, Israeli reserves in modified World War II Sherman tanks were deployed in the southern sector. They were opposing T-55s and even T-62s, the Russians' latest tank. Despite the 30-year technological gap, they destroyed greater numbers of Syrians. But at a cost. The 2 Israeli frontline brigades were virtually wiped out. They had, however, bought time for the citizen army. Mobilization had begun on Saturday. Many didn't wait for their code words. Seizing their equipment, they headed to either front, pressing lorries, cars and buses into service. One platoon even drove a milk float to their base in Sinai. Prime Minister Golda Meir expressed their mood.
This people, small as it is, surrounded as it is by enemies, has decided to live. And if we have to pay the price for living, we have to pay it. This is not a people that can give in.
Arriving piecemeal, the first reinforcements in the Golan were sent straight to the front. The situation was so desperate, there was no time for a coordinated response. In the south, the Syrians were now only 10 minutes tank drive from the Benot Yaakov bridge. By Monday morning, though, 36 hours into the war, the roads to the Golan were jammed with troops and equipment, in civilian as well as military lorries. Approaching the heights, they had to risk artillery fire directed from Mount Hermon, which had fallen to Syrian commandos in the first hours of the war. Fully mobilized, the Israeli army began to turn the tide. Casualties had been heavy. They lost 250 men in the first 2 days in the Golan. It was not a price a small army could keep paying. And from Monday, limiting casualties became a priority. They now relied more heavily on artillery to dislodge the Syrians at long range. Yet Israel's part-time soldiers sounded confident.
I think that we already are going to finish the war. They got the nice kick down, and we hope to be at the weekend at home.
It would not prove that easy. Syrian resistance remained stubborn in retreat, despite their staggering losses. The advancing Israelis counted 500 tanks among the wrecks strewn across the heights. North of Quneitra, the Syrian columns had been constricted by minefields, and the crack Israeli 7th Armoured Division hadn't wasted that advantage. They called the area the Valley of Tears. Abandoned among the wrecks were brand new Soviet Saga carriers, capable of firing 6 of these latest missiles. Israeli mechanized infantry cleared out pockets of resistance bypassed by the advancing armor, and by Wednesday the 10th, the Israeli Chief of Staff, General Elazar, could report on Israeli progress.
I am glad to tell you that we managed to push almost all of the Syrian forces to the ceasefire line.
But they were not stopping there.
Of the battles, we continue our counter-attack. We shall continue it tomorrow, and we shall break and destroy completely all the attacking forces.
The Israelis had cleared most of the Golan, but they could not switch to Sinai until the Syrian threat was destroyed. So they attacked again in the northern sector, using Mount Hermon as cover for their left flank. They crossed the ceasefire line into Syria on the 11th, taking the shortest route towards Damascus. 2 days later, they were 15 miles beyond the ceasefire line, only 25 miles from Damascus itself. The Syrian reserves put up strong opposition from prepared defences, and the Israelis had a hard slog all the way. With his capital threatened by Israeli artillery, President Assad appealed for an Egyptian attack in Sinai to relieve the pressure. Syrian MiGs joined the desperate defence, swooping on the columns on the left flank near Mount Hermon. But it was a rare appearance, for in the air, the Israelis were once more in control. The MiGs couldn't match them in aerial combat. And having destroyed the bulk of the Syrian missile system, they were now attacking targets all over Syria, disrupting the Soviet airlift of military supplies. At C2, they were choking the supply route. In the first ever naval missile battle, they virtually wiped out the Syrian Navy. And the Soviet Union was forced to move its own fleet to keep Syrian ports open. The Americans responded by reinforcing their 6th Fleet, a thinly veiled warning against further Soviet involvement. The Arab world too came to Syria's aid.
The Jordanian forces entered Syria and have been heavily engaged in action throughout yesterday.
4,000 men of the Jordanian 40th Brigade fought alongside an Iraqi armoured division, attacking the southern flank. But coordination between them proved difficult. Both suffered heavily at the hands of the Israelis. They were the last major armoured battles on the Golan front. The Israeli advance continued along the Damascus road until it ran up against the main Syrian defence line around Sassa. Now within artillery range of southern Damascus, the Israelis were content to hold their ground, switching forces to the Sinai front. In Sinai, by the 13th of October, the Egyptians had 3 bridgeheads on the eastern bank, which they'd extended sideways along most of the canal, but which were only 10 miles deep. Yet the Egyptians were confident They'd achieved most of their aims and were well dug in behind an anti-tank and anti-aircraft missile screen. All around them lay evidence of the damage they'd inflicted on the Israeli counterattacks. All they had to do was wait for the ceasefire according to plan. But Sadat had changed his mind. On his express orders, the two armoured divisions which formed the main reserve on the West Bank began crossing to the east, responding to appeals for action by President Assad. After the war, General Shazli claimed that for 2 days he had argued against this move, fearing that it left no protection on the West Bank. But finally, Sadat had given him a direct order, and he obeyed. The two fresh divisions were to lead a wide pincer movement to take Bir Gifgafa, forcing the Israelis to concentrate on their southern front. The Israelis were ready for them. It was what they'd hoped for. Tanks and infantry lay in wait, the latter now equipped with American TOW missiles. The further the Egyptians came beyond their anti-aircraft shield, the more damage they would suffer at the hands of the Israelis. At 6 a.m. on the 14th of October, the biggest tank battle since Kursk in World War II began. 2,000 tanks locked in combat along a 100-mile front. By nightfall, the Egyptians had lost a total of 264 tanks. The Israelis, only 10. Superior Israeli tactics account for part of that disparity, but another surprisingly simple reason was the suitability of the tanks to the desert terrain. When emerging from the hull-down position behind dunes, the main Israeli tank, the Centurion, could depress its barrel by 10 degrees, presenting a small target in order to fire. The lower-profile Soviet T-55 used by the Egyptians could only depress its barrel by 4 degrees and presented a much larger target in order to bring its gun to bear. It was not only the Egyptian armour that suffered. Once more they dropped paratroopers into and behind the lines, and once more the Israelis rounded them up. Despite that resounding defeat, President Sadat's drive to address the Egyptian People's Assembly on the 16th was akin to a Roman triumphal march. He and General Ismail were mobbed as they entered the assembly. They had given the Egyptian people a tremendous victory, restoring their national pride. In his address, President Sadat described the crossing of the canal as a miracle by any military standard, and went on to say the nation could feel safe and secure. It was now armed with a sword and a shield. But even as he spoke, a column of Israeli tanks was busy demolishing Egypt's shield. Not in Sinai, but in Africa. The Israelis had crossed the canal, and with no reserves to stop them, they were rampaging deep behind the Egyptian lines. Having identified the weak point where the Egyptian 2nd and 3rd armies met north of the Bitter Lakes, the Israelis had launched a counterattack on the 15th under General Sharon, forcing a passage through the Egyptian bridgehead and across the canal, where it began destroying the missile sites. It had been a risky affair. The hardest battle had been on the eastern bank near Chinese Farm, as paratroopers, armour and artillery fought for 2 days to stop the Egyptians from closing the gap behind the task force. Once across the canal, they'd found the ground undefended. The Egyptian armour was on the wrong bank. They moved freely over the Sweetwater Canal and began combined attacks on the missile batteries. Tanks covering the paratroopers as they swept through the bunkers. General Shazli was now at breaking point. He argued for the transfer of armour to the west, but Sadat dismissed the Israeli crossing as a mere television operation and secretly relieved Shazli of his command. It was the American airlift of military equipment to Israel that finally convinced Sadat of the gravity of his position. Material losses had been enormous on both sides, but he had expected the Israelis to grind to a halt long before his own Soviet supplies ran dry. Now he was forced to ask the Russians to arrange a ceasefire. Moshe Dayan had been against the crossing from the start, but had refused to make a decision either way. He told Elazar that he must decide on military grounds alone. But when they met in Sinai on the 19th, both knew that they now had everything to play for.
How is your task force doing on the other side of the canal?
Oh, well, that's one of the, how do you say, 64,000 questions.
How about the American equipment? Has any of that come into action yet?
Why should I say? Yes or no? What's good for our relationship? Anyway, we are very happy.
We are creating the necessary conditions to open our major offensive.
The Israelis now had 2 bridges across the canal, and their presence on the West Bank was growing stronger by the hour. They now tightened their grip on the towns and villages within an area of 1,200 square kilometers. The front line continued to expand, taking out more missile sites, punching a wider hole in the anti-aircraft umbrella, which allowed Israeli planes to threaten the Second Army positions further north. Belatedly, Egyptian resistance was growing, both on the ground and in the air. This air attack on the 22nd of October ended minutes before the announcement of a ceasefire. The evident delight of these soldiers was not shared by all Israelis.
No, I don't agree, because the Egyptians think that they succeeded in this war. They think that if they had placed some few hundreds of soldiers and tanks in our bank of the canal, then they think that this is a victory for them. And when the Arabs think that they have won or they have a big victory, this encourages them. And the next thing you'll know is that in a year or two, we'll have another war and more casualties.
But within hours, the ceasefire broke down. The Israelis seized their chance, dashing forwards to the outskirts of Port Suez. By the 24th, they had cut the Suez to Cairo road at kilometre 101 and were only 60 miles from the Egyptian capital itself. The Battle of the Ceasefire transformed the situation. The Israeli drive had now trapped the Egyptian Third Army in Sinai, cutting all its supply lines. They now held a tremendous bargaining counter in the south. In the north, the elite Golani Brigade fought a bitter battle to recapture Mount Hermon, losing 70 men. 8 hours before the ceasefire on the 22nd, their pennant was raised alongside the Israeli flag on the summit. Now the Israeli flag flew in Africa too. As the second ceasefire came into effect, the 2 armies watched each other warily across the canal from reversed positions. This time, United Nations troops had been sent to enforce it and to arrange the passage of supplies through Israeli checkpoints. It was a remarkable turnaround. The initial Egyptian triumph had been cut from under them. A whole army was now dependent on Israeli goodwill in order to survive. Each side had lost territory to the other, but with the missile shield torn open and 20,000 Egyptians captive in the desert, the Israelis now held the upper hand. At kilometre 101 on the Cairo road, for the first time ever, an Egyptian delegation arrived to negotiate directly with representatives of a country whose existence it did not even recognize. No one there would have believed that such a dialogue could continue, or that within 4 years, President Sadat would stand to address the Israeli parliament. At the heart of the country he had fought so hard to destroy.